Week 29, Overview, Ford's Integrity. This week we covered Gerald Ford, who had been appointed as vice president after Nixon's previous vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned after being charged with accepting bribes. Nixon was already in trouble when Agnew resigned. The Watergate scandal was unfolding, and Nixon knew there was a real chance that his presidency would not survive it. He called the leaders of both parties in the Senate to the White House to find out who might be confirmed by the Senate. Both the Democratic and Republican leaders had only one name to offer: Gerald Ford. Ford had a reputation for honesty and integrity. Whether he was for or against any issue, the men and women who worked with him felt that he always told them the truth. In recommending Ford for vice president, the leaders of the Senate were well aware that they were quite possibly choosing the next president. Ford faced huge problems and moral decisions as president. His decisions, and the way that he handled some of them, made many people angry. They gave firepower to his enemies, who ridiculed him as a bumbling placeholder instead of a competent leader. This week, rhetoric students in particular will closely examine the series of events that led to a good man being rejected as president by the majority of Americans. Other topics this week include the fall of South Vietnam and Mao Zedong's death. If your rhetoric students are following the church history track, the readings in Light Force focus on the Civil War in Lebanon, too. Ford never planned to be president. He didn't even plan to be vice president, but he was asked to serve in that office when Nixon's elected VP, Spiro Agnew, had to resign under a cloud. Ford had served for 25 years in Congress, where he was the minority leader for the Republicans. The fact that both political parties quickly and firmly recommended Jerry Ford, and only Ford, to replace the scandal-ridden Agnew spoke volumes about Ford's ability to work with Congress and his reputation for integrity. Ford took over the presidency after Nixon resigned and soon became the target of a great deal of criticism. The media portrayed him as a klutz. Well, that was hardly fair. He had played football in college and was offered contracts with 2 professional football teams. He turned them down in order to accept entry into Yale Law School via a coaching position there. At Yale, he graduated in the top quarter of his class. But that didn't keep his opponents, and the media, from calling him a dunce as well as a klutz. Ford faced tough choices from the minute he took office. One of the hardest was what to do about his predecessor. The prospect of Nixon's criminal trial was daunting. The Nixon matter already took up about 25% of the new president's time, and it would only get worse as the prosecution and defense prepared their cases. The trial would take forever, inflaming all the divisions between Americans, and at the end of it, Ford planned to pardon Nixon if he were found guilty. Why spend so much time and effort on a preordained outcome? Ford wanted to spare the nation all that pain and expense. He thought the country needed closure, not vengeance. He decided to pardon Nixon then and there, before he could be indicted. Unfortunately, that was not what many Americans wanted. Most people thought that Nixon should at least be indicted before he was pardoned, and were angered by Ford's abrupt announcement. Many suspected Ford had made a secret deal with Nixon in order to gain the presidency. Others simply felt that here was another man who could not be trusted, just like all the others. The pardon of Nixon may have saved America much pain and division in the long run, but it probably cost Ford any chance of being elected president in his own right. 8 days after the pardon, Ford made another controversial move. Ford offered a conditional amnesty to the 50,000 draft dodgers who had fled the country to avoid the war. He would allow them to come home if they promised to do 2 years of public service. Though it was well-intentioned, the amnesty offer was a political mistake. It angered Americans who had supported the war and offended those who had opposed it. If Nixon got an unconditional pardon, why not grant an amnesty without conditions? That was a bad start, and the economy made things worse. Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon had all engaged in a lot of government spending on the war and social welfare programs. Such spending used up a lot of money but did nothing to grow the civilian economy. When the Arab oil embargo during the 1973 Arab-Israeli War caused energy prices to spike, there was a significant and rapid rise in other prices across the U.S. Money that could have gone into expanding the economy went to energy costs. Sales went down and layoffs went up. Prices rose while the economy stayed flat. This was a new situation for economists. Normally, prices go up when there's more demand than supply. In such times, businesses need all the workers they can get, so there are more jobs than people to fill them. Ford's economic team had no idea what to do when prices rose while employment fell, and it showed. Ford's "Whip Inflation Now" campaign was a bust from the beginning, as it seemed to include no policy and was perceived as a poor public relations stunt. Ford then proposed tax cuts, which the Democratic majority in Congress successfully opposed. Then he suggested new taxes on imported oil. Congress opposed that, too. Ford appeared to flip-flop wildly as he sought to respond to the fast-changing economic challenges, and his critics were able to increasingly portray him as a bumbler who just was not up to the job of being president. Over the succeeding months, Ford improved in his leadership abilities and won back a measure of trust. But the lost ground at the start of his presidency, and the media's relentless mockery of him as a bumbling, subpar placeholder of the office and not a real president, hamstrung Ford's efforts to govern in his own right. The smell of Watergate sewage still clung to Ford's clothes, and Americans were not wholly convinced during his tenure that the image of the presidency could ever be fully healed. The oil embargo of 1973 showed the world how powerful the oil-producing nations could be. These had all been seen as poor and backward nations as long as they competed against each other, but when they formed the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, they realized that their new cartel could set whatever price they wanted for oil. With half the world's oil reserves in the lands around the Persian Gulf, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia took on a huge new importance. U.S. strategists knew they had to keep Russia and China from gaining influence over these countries, but after Vietnam, they weren't willing to send American troops to another land war in Asia. They decided to try to use the kingdoms of Iran, formerly known as Persia, and Saudi Arabia as bulwarks to prevent Soviet expansion in the Middle East, a policy known as the Twin Strategy. This intervention created problems for both Iran and Saudi Arabia. Each had internal problems with Islamic extremists who did not want their kings to cooperate with infidels. The Cold War clash of communism and capitalism paved the way for the coming conflict between secularism and militant Islam. One place where this broke out was Lebanon. Lebanon had a rich and diverse heritage. Land of the ancient city of Antioch, where believers in Jesus were first called Christians, it was home to major different branches of both the Christian and Muslim faiths. That diversity made it vulnerable to influence by outside powers who supplied the different factions with money and arms. For year after interminable year, Christian and Muslim militias shot at each other across the rubble of that once beautiful land. Let's end this week with the end of one story we've been following over many weeks. Chairman Mao Zedong reached the end of his long life in 1976, but not without one more round of upheaval for China. As Mao grew more feeble, his wife, Jiang Qing, put together a small group consisting of 4 of Mao's possible successors. The 4 included herself, a propagandist named Zhang Chongqiao, a writer named Yao Wenyuan, and a security official named Wang Hongwen. All 4 of them were hardcore revolutionaries who had become prominent during the Cultural Revolution. Mao was not happy with his wife, however, and did not want to name any of these 4 as his successor. As months passed and Mao became even frailer, it was unclear who would lead China once he was dead. When he finally died, an obscure party official named Hua Guofeng became premier and took over as chairman of the Chinese Communist Party. The new premier sided with the moderates and began a violent purge of the extreme radicals who opposed him. He labeled Mao's wife's group the Gang of Four and blamed them for the worst excesses of the Cultural Revolution. He had them all arrested, even Mao's widow. The party produced files that allegedly proved the crimes committed by this Gang of Four, and there were demonstrations all over China celebrating their downfall. The long revolutionary rule of Chairman Mao Zedong had finally reached its end. Ford took office in hard times. America had been humiliated in Vietnam, shocked by Watergate, rocked by an oil embargo. As a result, this humble, decent man was not reelected in 1976. But he deserves a great deal of honor for his service to his country. The leader of the opposing party, Democratic Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill, put it this way: "God has been good to America, especially during difficult times. At the time of the Civil War, he gave us Abraham Lincoln. And at the time of Watergate, he gave us Gerald Ford, the right man at the right time, who was able to put our nation back together again. Nothing like Watergate had ever happened before in our history, but we came out of it strong and free, and the transition from Nixon's administration to Ford's was a thing of awe and dignity."